I think most people think only about slavery in the 19th century South. They only think about cotton. In New York, you gain freedom only if you're born to an enslaved woman and then serve your mother's master for until basically your mid-20s. You didn't have to own a slave yourself to be invested in the success of slaveholding. The North had had slavery for almost 200 years, and in fact, in New Jersey, slavery doesn't end until 1865. The idea that you have to have flagrant Black death in order to create change is unfortunately a consistent theme in our history. It was definitely about slavery. As I say, look at any Confederate constitution.
I am here with Leslie Harris, a professor at Northwestern University, as well as an author of the novel Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863. I'm very excited personally to learn a bit more of the history, and I want to say thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for asking me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. So before we get into maybe some of the more direct themes in the book, or if this could very well tie into it as well, I thought it would be interesting to kind of ask you what you think the biggest or most common misconception about slavery in America is. I know there's plenty, but which one do you think people get most wrong?
I think most people think only about slavery in the 19th century South. They only think about cotton. They think that slavery is only in the South. And one of the things I did with my book was to look at slavery in the North and Black life in the North. I think also people imagine slavery as related to it being in the South. So it's something that happens only between 1800 and the Civil War, but we had 200 years of slavery before that. So slavery is foundational to this nation. It's really foundational to a lot of the wealth of Europeans and European countries at the time. Without enslaved labor, according to Europeans, they would not have been able to settle the Americas, broadly speaking, from Brazil and South America all the way up through North America. And slavery is something that everyone participated in, either directly through owning enslaved people or by investing in slavery. Without that enslaved labor, many of the colonies would not have been built in the way that they were.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it there a little bit, but I did want to start from the basics, asking what should be an obvious question. But the more I talk about these things with people, the more I realize that sadly, it's not so much to everyone. What kind of role did slavery or this Black labor specifically have in creating the foundation of our country? And then specifically, as you talk about in your book, in the North, like cities like New York City?
It's different, of course, in New York versus plantation labor in, say, colonial Virginia or Maryland. But if we look at New York as an example, when enslaved people were brought, Europeans had lived there among Native Americans, of course, for a couple of years, but they didn't really establish and begin building permanent buildings until enslaved labor arrived. 11 enslaved men who were brought to the island to Manhattan to begin building. And this is often true, not in every colony, but in many colonies, that Europeans who came over found life here very difficult. Some simply didn't have the skills they needed to create basic infrastructure, didn't have the agricultural skills sometimes. Sometimes there just weren't enough Europeans, and slave labor was foundational for many of them. If we look at the Americas as a whole, not just North America, but down, from South America, the Caribbean, and then North America, and look at those places as a whole, for every European, 4 enslaved people migrated to this region. So there was a Black majority in the Americas as a whole. European colonizing powers relied on slave labor, not only for its labor, but also to create the population that would be here.
Yeah, so then I guess speaking more specifically in the North, how prominent was slavery there? Is the gap, I know you speak in your book about being a lot more narrow than how people speak of it. And then also, what do you think kind of created this dichotomy of sorts where people speak of the North as there were no fears to be had for people of color there? There was no slavery. How did that kind of come to be a misconception?
Sure. So the biggest source of the misconception of the quote unquote free North, where slavery doesn't exist, comes out of the Civil War. That the North, after the Civil War, really reestablishes itself as the place that, first they won over the South in 1865, and they, take credit for quote unquote freeing the slaves, for ending slavery. But there are a couple of problems with that rather simplistic picture. One is that the North had slavery for almost 200 years, and in fact, in New Jersey, slavery doesn't end until 1865 with the 13th Amendment. As just one example of how deeply embedded slavery was in some places in the North. The second is that even though people in the North may or may not have owned slaves, and some Northerners did own slaves, they owned slaves from other places. People definitely invested in slavery. Rhode Island had a large number of enslaved people, but more importantly, it was a place where slave ships were built, where slave traders lived. Enslaved people from Africa would come and be distributed throughout North America. So a lot of the money of early Rhode Island is made through the slave trade and also through producing goods for slave colonies. Both in New York and Rhode Island, for example, wheat, cheeses, butter, dairy products, those were produced in those colonies and then shipped to places like Jamaica, to Barbados, because in those places, people were too busy making sugar and making money off of that. They didn't want to grow these other things. And so Rhode Island, I think also codfish, salted cod, they would salt the cod, put it in barrels, ship it south. So, I mean, of course, Jamaica is surrounded by water. You're thinking, why can't they fish their own? No, too busy, too much money to be made. So instead, they relied on these colonies to produce those kinds of goods. And Northern colonies also, of course, invested in the Southern North American colonies, like Virginia and Maryland. Sometimes the families, a family member would go and start a plantation in one of those places, or they would invest money in those places. So these economies are really interwoven, and you didn't have to own a slave yourself to be invested in the success of slaveholding. Your money could very well be tied up in a slave regime in another location in the Atlantic world.
Even if you weren't directly involved in the North, it seems like through investments or benefit, whether or not one way or the other. How much was the benefit economically? Were they about equal in the North and the South? Did they stand about the same to benefit from allowing this to continue?
That's a good question. I think that it's we can see it more clearly in the South. There's still more research that needs to be done in terms of really getting at how Northerners were invested. Wealthy Northerners had a little bit more diversity. They were trading with Europe and other places. But I think that I'll put it this way, the wealthiest people, I think, were in the South, in the Caribbean, et cetera, that those were the real money makers. And the North American colonies, compared to, in terms of Great Britain, the North American colonies were not the moneymakers. Jamaica, Barbados, those places where slavery was producing all this sugar and other products, those are the real moneymakers for the British Empire. I've been talking to some economic historians who are claiming that we are overestimating the importance of slavery. But my problem with some of their analysis is that, and this is another kind of myth of slavery that comes up, is that there's this belief that the reason people own slaves is just to enforce racism. I'm like, no, there's too much work in that. Like, if you're not making money out of that, there's kind of no reason to do that in that way. And so I think we need more research into thinking about how slavery supported wealth for these folks.
And I think that's a perfect way to put it. One of the things I did want to be sure to ask you was kind of speaking to the other ways, even when in some of the northern states where slavery was abolished, some of the fears that people of color could still have was the Fugitive Slave Act. Could you kind of describe the detriment that was for people of color in the North? I'm sure without DNA or kind of just going off hearsay, it got pretty horrendous pretty fast. So I was just wondering the kind of rundown there.
Right, absolutely. So even when slavery ends in the North, there is often an assumption that Black people are slaves. Part of the reason for that is that slavery ends gradually in the North. So, for example, in New York, you gain freedom only if you're born to an enslaved woman and then serve your mother's master for until basically your mid-20s. So you're still in a form of bondage. That's one thing. The other thing is that many of these northern locations, again, have deep roots to the South. Southerners would come north, they would travel north, they had cousins, there were families that, the slaveholding cousin would come visit. And Southerners would also come north seeking their fugitive enslaved people who had left the South and tried to leave slavery behind. So you have these slave catchers, people who literally made a living recapturing, as they put it, Black people to send them back south. And as you pointed out, they did not always. There was not DNA. They had images. They had descriptions, but it is not to the same degree of necessarily of precision, shall we say, as we maybe have now. We even have problems today with DNA testing, which supposedly works, but we've seen some problems there too.
Yeah.
So in even in places like New York, where people were surrounded by anti-slavery activists and other Black people who tried to prevent this from happening, there were kidnappings. So you would have a certain amount of money if you found that the Black person was actually free, and it was a smaller amount. But if they found that you were a slave, the amount was doubled. So there was an incentive when you went to court to prove your freedom. There was an incentive for the judge to find that you were actually enslaved and should be sent back south. That there had already been fear about being captured as a slave, but and re-enslaved or enslaved as Solomon Northup was when you were not actually enslaved. But then in 1850, when that happened, people really knew that there was a target, and a lot of people left. Some people went to Europe. Frederick Douglass, very famously, and other Blacks went to Europe to try to get out of the law. Some went to Canada, of course. Some just moved farther north, hoping that because they weren't in cities, they would not be as visible. But it was a very difficult and very frightening time.
And something else I think could help set the stage of maybe the sort of state of mind and fear or constant threat that people of color were living in the time. And I know that like I said, in some states, slavery had been abolished prior to this, but could you maybe describe some of the events leading up to and on the New York City draft riots in 1863?
So the period of time between, say, 1850 and the Civil War was an incredibly tense time in the nation as a whole. In New York, because it had such strong ties to the South, it was a very racist place. There had been already a number of race riots around the fact that anti-slavery activists were arguing not only for the end of slavery, but for racial equality. That for the radical abolitionists, they really believed that you couldn't only end slavery, you also had to deal with racism. And although they were imperfect, they were really strong on that issue and really tried, in collaboration, Blacks and whites really tried to live into equality and argue that Blacks should have full rights to politics, et cetera. So when the Civil War finally breaks out, there's a very strong contingent of white New Yorkers who favor the South, who are concerned that if Blacks gain freedom through the Civil War, that Black people would come to New York and take jobs away from whites. There is also very strong resentment among poor whites, Irish and other white working class people, because wealthy people can buy their way out of the war by paying someone else or paying a bounty to the government, but they cannot. And they have no way to escape the war. There is a lottery system that's put into place to draft them into war, and they have no way out. And it's literally a wheel where they're going to be pulling names out of the wheel, and they burn down the draft office, and they burn one of those wheels. And then they turn their animus against Black people. And there are several days of riots. They do destroy the Colored Orphan Asylum, which is a building that is really a massive symbol of Black-white collaboration. The women who started the Colored Orphan Asylum took in hundreds of children over the course of the 19th century, helped them find an education and jobs. These are children of often of working class parents. The parents couldn't always take care of them, and so they would work with the women and take them to this institution. And so these rioters burned down this building. Fortunately, none of the children or the women who ran the asylum were killed. There are in other places burning of Black businesses, of Black homes, the lynching of, we think about 24 Black men, women, and women. Some of it quite sexualized, just in the way that we think of lynching in the late 19th and early 20th century in the South. And the city is really kind of destroyed. So this is probably, it's believed to be one of the, if not the worst riot in New York City history. It is a complete low point for New Yorkers. Many Black New Yorkers flee, saying that they will never return. They go to Brooklyn, they go farther away, they never coming back to New York after that. Whites, elite whites are also ashamed of what has happened. Even some quite, I would say, some whites who before were quite racist, some of them, I think, have this moment of clarity in which they realize that this is no way to run a society. And they try to do their best to support the Black victims of the riot, to make sure that they are safe, that they can return home. And this is, repeated in our history. I think back to the events of 2020. I think back to the AME Church massacre in Charleston. And, you have to kill 7 or 8 people in a church to take the Confederate flag down. We have to watch George Floyd have the life strangled out of him in order for people to realize that police brutality is a problem. And then how quickly do we forget? The idea that you have to have flagrant Black death in order to create change is unfortunately a consistent theme in our history. And I just wish we really could find a different way.
Yeah, so I want to get to kind of the lasting effects we saw after the war in this period. But I do have to ask you while we're here and still in the time period, because this is sort of a silly point, but a point of contingency nonetheless you see online. So I figured I'd ask you another obvious question. We'll get 2 easy ones this interview. Was the Civil War about slavery? And if not, what was it about?
Oh, it was definitely about slavery. As I say, look at any Confederate Constitution. The Confederate States that seceded created their own new state constitution, as well as, of course, the Constitution of the Confederacy. They based it on the U.S. Constitution, but all of their statements of secession state that the reason they are seceding is slavery. They are seceding to protect slavery. They are protecting states' rights, as they say, so that they can hold on to slavery. There is no question. It is within the first lines, if not the first paragraph, of every article, every statement of secession. And that's very clear. That's very clear also to Lincoln, that this is the fear is that even though he was anti-slavery, but he tried to hold the Union together by saying, we're not going to touch slavery where it is. But they thought they could not get over the fact that he did not like slavery at all. He really didn't think it was a good system. And when he's elected, they think, well, this is the end. And that is not only because of Lincoln as an individual, it's because there had been decades and decades of discussion and debate. And people knew that Northerners, not all of them, but many of them had this small number of radicals and Black people and the whole situation, finally, by the time that the Civil War erupted, more and more people had agreed at least that slavery should end in the North. They knew that there was this division. And the Southerners rightly were very concerned that at some point soon, there would be enough people in the North who would turn over, and say, no, slavery is not a part of our nation. It is central. It is the thing that leads to the Civil War.
And that's what I always try to tell people too. And they always have like caveats they want to add, like they'll say states' rights, and states' rights to do what, or
What?
territorial expansion, and what did they want to
They
expand?
want to expand, right? They
Exactly. It
thought
always
that
comes back to slavery.
exactly, because they thought that if they didn't expand, slavery would die also. And Lincoln had that thought too. It's like, well, if we just contain it in those states where it already is, then, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, just moving forward then, talking about the lasting effects after the war and such, leading into like Jim Crow, the segregation, everything following. What kind of effects can we see shortly after, I guess, even leading till now that could still linger in class, community, politics, just across the board? What kind of effects did this cause?
Sure. So immediately after the Civil War, there is a lot of struggle, a lot of backlash, and a lot of violence. It is really an incredibly, the war is the most violent war still that the U.S. has fought in terms of loss of life. Um, After the war is over, there is a lot of struggle about what does ending slavery mean? What does this mean? And there's an incredible amount of violence, whites on blacks, and an incredible attempt to um, harness Black power. I'm avoiding saying re-enslave Blacks because I
Mhm.
think what whites are trying to do is to figure out if we can't enslave them because of we lost and the 13th Amendment, how can we still
How
control?
close can we get? Yeah.
Exactly. How close can we get?
Mhm.
Exactly. And so that leads to a lot of conflict and a lot of violence. The North steps in and really shuts some of that down, and also provides an opportunity for Blacks to occupy elected office in greater numbers than they ever have since, from very local, say from the sheriff level, all the way up to Congress. And it is an incredible moment of change and transformation for Black people, where they, as a group, are living into what the possibilities of America are economically, democratically, in terms of mobility, and I mean physical mobility, that no one is telling them where they have to be. It is freedom on a level that I don't think it'll take a long time to get there again.
Mhm.
So that, of course, gets shut down um, in the 1870s with the end of Reconstruction, this period in which the nation is trying to build itself on a new platform. And unfortunately, the legacies of slavery really are racism, the continuation of the idea that white people, that this is I'll say a white person's country. Some say at the time white man's country, but they really mean white men, women, and children, that
Mhm.
it's their country, that Black people are there to serve white people. This idea, the idea of racial segregation, the separation of the races, a ludicrous idea given how intimately, slavery brought Black and white people together. I mean, I laugh because Black people are doing everything for white people under slavery. So then, and they still do, be clear, in segregation, they are still working in homes, working for white people. This is not, but segregation is about creating a hierarchical system
Mhm.
and making sure that Black people have the worst of everything, the worst schools, the worst homes, you don't deserve, and that white people remain on top. And so that becomes the struggle over the next 100 years. I would say down to today, how do we root out this idea of racial inequality? How do we move um, this idea of white supremacy, that one group, whites, have the right of life and death over Black people? That really continues to be the struggle, today, I think.
It seems to manifest itself in society in a multitude of ways that still, and like I said, I try to push to people today, that still affects people to this day. And that's why some people, when they try to come with the arguments of if we just stop talking about it or acting like it didn't happen, you see with like, I don't know how much you follow politics, but like with Ron DeSantis in Florida, they're taking CRT out of schools and stuff like that. And that's not how you fix a wound. You have to fix what caused the problem to really fix the root of it.
Exactly. Anyone will tell you that, you can't pretend it's not happening. You can't, suppression, psychological suppression on a societal level, all of those things do not help. You have to directly face the problem. And we still struggle to do that in this country.
Yep,
So.
yep, we do. So before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance. If there's any last points you feel like we didn't touch, if you want to drive those home, definitely tell people, shout out the book, where they can find it. If there's any projects now you're working on, the floor is yours.
Sure. I still love talking about New York City. I'm still working on projects. I will shout out one project. The Tenement Museum in New York has just opened its first apartment focusing on a Black family, and I encourage people to go see that. The new permanent exhibition is called Union of Hope, 1869, and it talks about some of the themes that we've talked about in terms of New York City history and Black history and how it's part of larger New York City history, but how people have survived there for centuries, and thinking about what will be the future there amid climate change.
Awesome. And we'll be looking forward to that as well. And it was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for informing us and letting us be a little more educated on very important issues that more people need to know about. So just thank you again for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.